make it this morning. It also lets you go back and listen to this again if you want to, if you're needing to talk through it with somebody else. And always makes me a little nervous when we're talking PEEMS and we're being recorded, and hope I speak everything correctly, because PEEMS is, I don't speak the same language. But one of the reasons that we've brought Mary over with us today and are doing this is she and I have found over time that things get rolled out from TEA that are CTE and PEEMS related, and the two sides kind of speak a little bit different language, and they sometimes don't speak clearly enough for everybody to understand it. And we found that as a team, this seems to go better because she knows one side and we know the other side, and we can hopefully help everybody make sense. We knew there were changes coming, and that there had to be changes coming in PEEMS because of the new tiered funding. We knew that that looked different. So it isn't that you guys need to live in the very intricacies of PEEMS, but it is very helpful if you have a working knowledge and an understanding of what they're doing on their side. It makes sense when you guys work together, and it helps with timelines for you to know what they're trying to do. So anything you have to get to them, you get to them with enough time for them to complete it. And so, Mary, would you like to go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself?
Had to click the button correctly. Hi, I'm
We're
Mary
not hearing you,
Morgan.
Mary.
Oh, you're not hearing me.
There we go. Now we are.
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, it's probably delayed a couple of seconds.
Okay.
I'm Mary Morgan. I'm the lead PEEM specialist here at ESE 11, and we just held a spring conference a couple of weeks ago where we discussed what Lisa is going to present to y'all, and she presented it then also. And I have to tell you, we had been to training via webinar with TEA, and they discussed the CTE tiers and the changes that are coming. And if I didn't have Lisa to make everything so much easier to understand, I'd be in a bad place. So, and just be sure you communicate with your PEEMS coordinators also, is what I want to say, so that everybody's on the same page and understands what's going on. And your PEEMS people can create reports for you to look at everything, but there's certain reports that will not be available until after the PEEMS submission is complete. So be sure you verify the reports that your PEEMS people provide to you beforehand, showing you how the courses are set up and what kind of coding they have before PEEMS is submitted. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. I'm out in districts a lot for different things, and some of the time Mary has been with me when we've done this, and I say this to people all of the time. It doesn't matter what great work you're doing in your district if it isn't correctly reflected in PEEMS, because that's the only way it makes it to TEA. We have districts that will, have maybe had kids earned their associate's degree and did a great job and think, man, they're rocking and rolling on that and going to have great CCMR. And when we look at PEEMS reports on the other side after the fact, and say, do you know how many of those you got credit for? And he's like, well, all 11 of them. No, 0. None of those were actually entered in PEEMS. It has to be done so that the information makes it to TEA, or as far as they're concerned, it didn't happen.
Correct. And they're not going to allow you to come back and make a correction after the fact, after you've had 2 chances with a submission and a resubmission, Lisa. They may allow you to change the data, but you don't get credit for it.
And so, that's really, an important piece of the puzzle for you, that, you need to be making sure. And if it isn't you who is that person, you need to know who is that person that's making sure all of that happens for CTE and for CCMR, because it's not just CTE. There's a lot of pieces of CCMR. Some pieces come from third parties, but other pieces come through PEEMS from you. And so, we need to make sure that this complicated process is a team effort, or it'll never end up being successful. So just kind of, the reason behind the updates, I know that you guys are really pretty familiar with this, that, House Bill 1525 made some changes during the 2019 session. And then House Bill 3, when it was passed, made changes to school finance. Then in 2021, they did House Bill 1525 to affect that House Bill 3. And it did some things cleaning up some unintended consequences that had happened, mostly that affected our small rurals, and it was to clean that up. But then it also, made some changes to funding codes, and so it was amended to increase the annual allotment to a three-tiered multiplier system. We've always been a 1.35. If you were earning weighted credit, it was going to be 1.35. It was just really, you had to be real careful on the PEEM side locally to make sure you had the right V code. Was it a V1 because it was a one period class, a V2, you taught it for 2 periods or the equivalent of 2 periods if they were work-based learning, a V3 if it was 3 periods or the equivalent of 3 periods. And then it automatically multiplied it times that 1.35. Well, that's a lot more complicated now because with the new tiered funding, we have moved that, to something different. And so the 21, 22 submission updates are going to be reflective of that. And so when you see in the past, those V codes didn't have to be separated out. We used to be able to kind of collect our V codes per student. If you had a student that sat in 3 classes, they were in a 1 period class. Let's use a health science student as an example. They took a 1 period class that was medical terminology. They were also in an anatomy and physiology, another 1 period class, and they were in a 2 period practicum. That student was a V4 and it multiplied times 1.35. That was pretty simple. But now, if you did that, that medical terminology would be a tier 2. It's 1.28 funding. And anatomy and physiology would be a tier 3, a 1.47. And the practicum would be a tier 3, a 1.47. And so they can't just multiply them straight across by the number of V codes a student sits. It's We still have our students cap at 6. No individual student can earn weighted funding for more than the equivalent of 6 periods. Chances of there ever being a student who's sitting in more than 6 period equivalent is pretty rare, because a student in a 6 period equivalent would be taking almost nothing but CTE. Being in our P-TECHs or something like that, they're knocking off a lot of their high school credits very early. There are some rare cases where we could start to see some kids do that, especially if maybe they were doing a 7 period day plus they worked a job outside of school for the equivalent of 2 periods to be getting work-based learning. We occasionally have some of those overachievers that are taking anything and everything, and they could calculate that up. You max out at that funding of 6. So when we look at that updated general reporting requirements, this is that change. So that new CTE multiplier is laid out. And so the service ID, which is that PEAMS code number, each course has a unique service ID, and you have to be very careful about entering those. In the past, I mean, if you entered it, you were giving the student the wrong credit on their transcript, which was definitely a problem. But now you could be giving them wrong credit on their transcript, and if you put in a code that gave you one level, a tier 1 funding, you might get 1.1, and it's supposed to be a tier 3, 1.47. You could be really shorting yourself on funding. So it can hurt you in two ways. It hurts the student and it hurts the district fiscally. So it is always, I always say, you need more than one set of eyes to lay their eyes on these to make sure they're right. When that master schedule gets built, and then again at semester change, you always want to have multiple people look, because it's real easy to invert two numbers. We actually found in the last meeting that Mary was in with TEA that they had one of the courses on their documents wrong in 2 places. They had it labeled as one service ID number, but on a third document that you would use for reference, they used a different number, which was a different weighted funding and a different course altogether. So, you just need to be real careful about making sure you're using those appropriate service IDs. And then you set it up for that appropriate V code. Is it a V1? Is it a V2? Is it a V3? One place where I would say that some people get confused on that, it's a semester course, so it should be a 0.5. There is no V code that's a 0.5. They may only be in it for a semester, but they're in it for an entire period during that semester, so it's still a V1. when the semester changes, they no longer are in that service ID. They go to a different course. And so then they become a V1 in whatever the new course is that they're sitting in. So V1 is as low as that will ever go. Can you go back one for me, Chelsea? Sorry. CTE put out that Cte Fte Calculations document so that you can look and see what weighted funding each course should get. And so it gives you the service ID. Remember, if it's got an N in front of it, that it is an innovative course. If then it has the course title. It has what course level it's going to be on those 3 weighted tiers. Is it a level 1, a level 2? I'm sorry, I misspoke, and I'm hoping I'm not going to confuse people. It is their course level based on their program of study. And so we have things that can be in 4 levels of program of study. Level 1 and level 2 are going to get you tier 2, which is that 1.28. If it's in a level 3 or a level 4 in a program of study, those are advanced courses. That's that tier 3, that highest weighted funding at 1.47. If it doesn't appear in any program of study, in this column, you'll see that NA. So business English is one of those examples that is on there. Business English is not on any of the published programs of study. So therefore, it will not receive those higher tiered fundings. It's going to be a 1.1 weighted funding. Doesn't mean you can't offer it. It's still a legitimate course. It just will not provide you the same level of funding. The ones that you want to be real careful with this on that have thrown people is if you look down a little bit on that page to the second one that's labeled NA, that's Career Prep 2. Career Prep 1, right above it, is a level 4. It's 1.47. So Career Prep 1, if you take it as a junior and then as a senior, you put them in Career Prep 2, you're going to drop down from 1.47 funding down to 1.1 funding. And those can be either a V2 or a V3 course. So that could change your funding significantly if you went from a course that Career Prep 1 and you were teaching it for the equivalent of 3 periods because they were working 15 hours on average at a career job, a work-based placement. In 3 periods times 1.47 is a lot of funding. But then as a senior, they continue on with that and you put in, it's a valid course. It's got a valid service ID, but it's going to not be on those programs of study. So it's going to drop you back down to that 1.1 weighted funding. And that was a bit of a surprise to people when that came out, that it was done that way. So you kind of need to think through the progression of your courses and what you're putting your students in. So when we look at submission updates, CTE calculations had to be done differently. Remember, they couldn't just calculate, figure out how many V codes the student was a total of, and then multiply them times 1.35. So this is showing you some examples. And so you've got that you pull from their campus and what track and what reporting period. And you look at that, the CTE course, it's a CTE tier 1. Then they do it separately for the courses that are CTE tier 2. And then again for tier 3. And then they do that for each reporting period. So each of those 6 weeks reporting periods are calculated separately. Is that correct, Mary? Did we
Sorry,
lose?
I couldn't get the unmute to unmute. Yes, it is
So,
going to be by track and then reporting period. And because you'll have this course looks at tier 1, this one at tier 2, and possibly this one tier 3.
okay. And then it will multiply them out. And then those things have to be added together to get your funding. And so it looks a little bit different. I have a question in the chat. In practicum, second time taken is also 1.1? No. Practicums, and well, I don't want to say I swear by 100% of the practicums, but the practicums, they didn't do that with. It was career prep that they did that with, where they said the second time it was taken. Because they said practicum or career prep second time taken was basically a repeat course. And so they weren't willing to give the funding for them to do the same course a second time because it had the same TEKs. And that was when we asked why that was the case, that was the answer. Practicum, they didn't say that for. So they didn't. So you can do the practicums, multiple times, and you'll continue to get that higher weighted funding. So for your submission updates, this is looking at those FTE calculations. It's still also, I mean, like I said, this is a pretty confusing process because it's got to look at the service ID, it's got to look at what V code it is, then it's got to look at what tier it resides in, then it has to look at attendance. And so the attendance, it takes, plays into effect here. So if because I've had a number of people that have talked to me here recently and they said, we're looking at our summary of finance and we're looking at our monies that are coming in for some things and they seem to be down a bit, but our FTEs are where they should be. But your FTEs are multiplied by your attendance. When if you have been using the CTAT estimator to kind of estimate out what you thought that would look like, it does it automatically by a 95% attendance. But if, say, that first 6 weeks of school, your attendance was 88%, that you're going to take a financial hit because when you multiply out that amount of funding times a lower percentage of days, then you start to lose funding. The submission updates, have run through. This is just kind of showing you a quick snapshot off of your principal's report for your student attendance, and that it will know where it used to just give you the CTE, FTE as one thing. It now will be on 3 separate lines. It'll be divided out based on the tiers so that you can see the different levels of funding. I know this is real small. It's just kind of showing you a snapshot off of that, and we will be sharing out the PowerPoint so you can have it a little bit larger. But it's just showing you kind of overall what that would look like. But this is a screenshot off of that PEAMS superintendent's report for career and technical education eligible days, so that you're able to, be verifying those. Mary, is there anything you want to talk to them about when to access these reports?
I think they're not going to be available to see everything until.
There we go.
Can you
Start
hear me
again,
now?
'cause we
Okay,
weren't
I'm
hearing you at
sorry,
first.
it's delayed. The reports, if I can remember correctly, are not going to be available till after the submission, after you've submitted your information. So it's there's no way for you to view what these calculations are going to be till everything. So remember, you have a submission one, then you have the availability of a resubmission. They need to be sure they're verifying that data so that if they have to resubmit, they can get the resubmission done. And the dates of those submissions are, the first one is submission one is due 6/16, and the resubmission is due July 21st. Okay.
So you want to be thinking, who is it that needs to be reviewing these to make sure they're correct in that window, and make sure that somebody has the time to do that and they're available. You may not be somebody who has the rights to get these. You may have to ask somebody to pull them for you. But I'm going to expect that every district will want somebody that's verifying them. And so if you're the person that would know the right information, be able to tell that it was correct, if you don't have the rights in Teal to pull these reports, or in your student information system to be pulling these reports, you want to make sure that you go to the people who do have the rights and ask them to provide you copies of the reports so that you can make a good review of them and then provide feedback, so that if there is a need to change something in PEAMS, you find that that a course was miscoded, you find that you look at it and you think there should have been a lot more funding for that. Well, maybe it was a V3 course and it was mistakenly coded a V1, and that's why that looks like there's a lot less funding. You always want to make sure you're doing that second look.
And so, Lisa, I want to say there is the PEAMS coordinators should be creating these reports and providing them to different program areas to verify. Like the CTE report should go to the CTE coordinator or director at the district for them to verify the information. But we have several new PEAMS coordinators this year. So if you're a CTE director, you need to be in communication with that PEAMS coordinator saying, hey, I need these reports. Want to be sure you don't forget to create them for me. I'd like to look at them, that type of thing.
Great information. And we're coming into summer where we may have staff changes. You might be suddenly stepping into a new role, or there may be somebody coming behind you, and you want to make sure you're leaving a list for the person who's about to replace you if you're switching positions. Or I don't know that I've got any of you on here that are retiring, but those things start to happen. And that's going to be something that has to happen in that time frame. There's a very limited window to make these corrections, because after that second submission, you sign off on those when you are submitting them. Generally your superintendent is signing off on all of that and says, okay, everything that's here is right. So if you find that you've done something wrong, they say, so sorry, too bad. You told us it was all right. There's no going back. And when you think about how many districts and how many campuses across the state, if it was an ongoing thing that they constantly let people reopen and do that, their staff would never be able to complete the work that needs to be done. So, it makes sense that they have to have hard dates that they lock these things down. But it can be very frustrating if you find that you missed out on something.
Lisa, on occasion, they will allow districts to submit files in what's called a working collection, but there is a process for that they have to go through. And on occasion they do, depending on the amount of money, if it's really going to hurt a district drastically, there is a possibility they might give them the funding that they had missed, or missed reporting the requirements for. But as far as CCMR and accountability, if it's something that's going to give them extra credit there, that's not where they're very forgiving on that. You should have had it done by the as of date of the resubmission.
That's really good information to know. Thank you, Mary. I'm glad you shared that. All right. And so lastly, we wanted to make sure, and you don't have to quickly try to write these down because you're going to get the PowerPoint and you'll have those. But if you're not sure what reports to be asking to have to be reviewing, these are the report numbers, and then what in those individual reports. You've got those special programs, attendance data. You've got your superintendent and principals attendance reports, your superintendent and principal CTE, eligible days, comparison of your current year and your prior year attendance, which right now in these last few years of COVID is not as helpful as it typically is. In a typical time frame when we're not having our attendance be so wonky because of things like COVID, that was one of those things that was really a good way for you to look to see, am I on track with where I typically was at this time last year. Your campus attendance diagnostics, then your summary reports for your attendance, both your superintendent and principals version, and then attendance by district of residence. So you've got, a lot of reports that are there for you to be able to access and work through to help get you some information. Your PEAMS people live in these things, so they can help you to understand them. It's all right to go ahead and talk to your people and say, this isn't my world, but I know I need to review these. Please tell me what I'm looking at. What exactly is on all of this, so that you're tying it to the correct information when you're going back and making sure that it's all good. These are your submission updates. This is something that I know, and I'm going to in a minute ask if anybody has some great ideas on some of this. This was something that was new, and it has thrown people. And I've had a lot of people say, why are they asking this of CTE and not just asking this of everybody? But you're now having to go in and code some things specific to TEA about some subpops that we've never been asked to be looking at our information tied to. Your pregnancy related services, your homebound, or state school students, your 7th, 8th grade students that are generating more than one CTE contact hour per day. That's where TEA is going to be kind of looking at. So remember that in the past, you could not, a 7th and 8th grader couldn't earn any weighted funding. They can now if they complete a high school credit course. Well, that's going to let that TEA have access pretty quickly, and you, to see what kind of funding you're bringing into the district tied to those 7th and 8th graders that never had access to funding in the past. The students reporting more than 3 excess contact hours a day, and then that percentage change from the previous year. So these reports were tentatively scheduled to be updated May 6th on a software release. Mary, can you give us update? Have they released?
Yes, they have released, and so they should be updated. If you find an error with any of these within these reports, discuss it with your PEAMS coordinator. She can if you're still not seeing the number of the data that you think you should be, she can submit what is called a TIMS ticket, or contact us first, and we can look and see if there is what's called a known issue. That means they are aware there's a problem with this report or not displaying correct information. And that does happen more often than we would like for it to.
And one that is an example that we've dealt with actually just in this past week is that courses, CTE dual credit college courses that your students were doing the entire year in one semester, and it was two different courses, was using the same service ID. Well, they're getting an error code because it doesn't let you do the same course twice, but they really legitimately are. And so, there's some errors that are being kicked back that are having to be worked through to figure out how are they going to distinguish that coding for those dual credit courses.
And that, it's a duplicate course completion as well as doubling the attendance for those classes. So we have a TIMS ticket on that. We're waiting to hear from them. Yes.
Yeah. And so, we don't have an answer on that one yet. So if you're one of the people that um, finds that happens, kind of be on the watch out. Once Mary hears back, if there's something specific that we need to do and it's not a fix on the TEA side, if there's something we need to do different to enter it on our side, we will share that out. She'll share it with PEAMS people, and I will share it out with you guys through the listserv so that you're aware. So one of the other things that we want to talk quick about is that overview of the extended year CTE data collection. So that was one of the things that they kind of found was when we had students that were completing CTE courses in the summer, they were not counting in your completer status calculations. It was only if it was completed during the school year, but you had students that were completing things. So that was something that they had to go back and fix. And so that was fixed during the extended year data collection. And so that summer CTE grant, where people were doing courses, CTE courses, and the grant it was a TEA grant that asked you to offer these and have the students complete them. But then when they did them, you weren't getting credit for those courses, and the individual students they were getting them on their transcript, but they weren't getting them calculated in their accountability as far as a level of program of study. And so that has been cleaned up and is being able to be collected now if they're completing things in Summer Bridge or through that summer grant process. And so the extended year CTE data collection, there's some specific rules that are tied to it. If they've completed that high school CTE course or a CTE dual credit course in the summer, and then that there's some general requirements in the Student Section Association as far as how PEAMS is submitting in that extended year submission time period, which Mary, is that an August submit?
Yes, ma'am, it is. It is August. It's August 25th, but it's for the 21-22 school year. It's what's called submission 4.
Okay. And
And
so
again, that's one of those things. Their PEAMS coordinators may not be aware that any students completed CTE courses unless they communicate with them and let them know.
So that constant communication, and really as a CTE person, you need to think of that PEAMS department as a piece of your team. I recommend you invite them to meetings, and I recommend that you make sure that they are comfortable having conversations with you. They know you, because things change so fast lately that you really need both sides of that team to be able to keep up with all of that what's changing and make sure that you're getting the appropriate credit for the great things that you're doing in your districts. And so on those update for the general reporting requirements for the student section. And so again, that added time frame, and then your extension complex courses for your high school CTE courses. Remember, it's not the middle school, it's only if it's a high school completed course. You aren't getting any credit for those middle school completion courses. It's the things that have the H in the CO22 list, so that you know that they're receiving that. It's heavily tied to like the college prep, which is not going to be CTE. The college prep is going to be your English and math, and there's a lot of that that's going to be done. But some of you are running some things and doing some things specific through some of those grants that are tied to CTE. And then they've updated the following data validation rules. And so, when they're looking at, there should not be more than 8 course transcripts for a unique student. They should not have more than their dual credit indicator codes, or the service ID must be at both high school and a CTE course, and the H is labeled on the CO2 table. What's really important in that is your crosswalk. What codes, what you're getting to give the students credit for on those CTE dual credits is based on what is in the MOU with your post-secondary partner, and what courses in your crosswalk when you decided to build this, that with them and worked, and you looked at which TEKs it was aligning to and what they were being taught. It can be taught in, some of these are taught at the colleges, some of them are taught in-house. Either of those are acceptable ways of doing things, but you need to always make sure what ends up in the student information system is aligned to specifically what it says the student is completing the work for, to receive the credit on. The Mary, is there anything that you need to add to that?
No, I was just going to say that these are the edits that TEA runs against your data that's submitted for PEIMS. Okay, that's it's their way of making sure your data is clean, that you're submitting the correct information. So a fatal will not be submitted through PEIMS. It's just a total no. It will not go through. The S, which means a special warning, those are saying, hey, look at me. This is not the norm. It could be, but is it really what's happening? So again, that's just a special saying, hey, look at this information. Is it correct? And if it is, it's not a problem for it to go ahead and be submitted through PEIMS.
But that second one on that list is showing an F, a fatal. It would be as if it wasn't there. Once it went submitted through, it doesn't go.
Correct.
So if you need it to be there, you've got to fix those fatals. You've got to
Yes.
fix. So I know when I was in district, we, would run our fatals reports pretty consistently, like daily in early at certain times of the year, so that we didn't have a ton of things to clean up all at once. We were catching things as errors were found.
Yes.
This is a new TSDS report. It's a student course completion detail. And so, you'll get the individual student names, their unique ID, that student service ID, the service ID for the course that they're in, and then their class IDs. So if you're in a big district, this is a massive report.
Definitely.
And so, you hopefully, everything is clean on how you set the courses up, so that you don't have any problems on the individual student side.
And that's a big thing at the beginning of the year, or even like right now, and it began usually in February or March. Your PEIMS coordinators, or whoever is in charge of creating your master schedule for the next year, it's important to communicate with them now, because that's when those courses are being created. And you definitely want to review them and make sure they're correct for next year. And hopefully they've all been correct for this year.
Yep. Yeah, and remember, it is, I try to remind people this all the time. It is not PEIMS responsibility. They enter what they're told to enter. it isn't their responsibility to know that you're teaching this specific version of a practicum tied to this and to know what you're teaching in the classroom. If you tell them this is the course, they're going to enter whatever the course is. If somebody, gave them some wrong information, they have no way of knowing that. That isn't their job. Their job is to, make sure they enter correctly what is provided to them. So it is on the department to make sure that what you share with them is accurate. And then there's always opportunity for human error, whether it comes from your side or their side. You're typing in a number and you reverse 2 digits. I mean, that kind of stuff happens. And so that's why you want more than one set of eyes on this. This is also another TSDS report. This is your CTE education student roster. And so definitely need to be looking at those. One of the things that you can see on this is if you look at 3 columns in from the right, it's telling you where the student falls on their CTE progression in programs of study. They're not in CTE at all. They're an explorer. They're only taking one course, but so they're just kind of getting started. They're a concentrator or a completer or a participant. So, we have those different things that are doing, and that's really good for you to be looking at because you're we know that somehow being a completer is getting added to accountability. We'll know later this month what that looks like. But this is where that information is going to come from for them to see that. That's because they auto code that. You don't go in and code and say, this student is a concentrator, this student is a completer. It is all done based on TEA pulling the course completions that the student has that's done. Remember, there's a little bit delay from the old days when you got to self code and you could code based on intent or based on what the student was sitting in. When they're doing this, they only will calculate this based on what they've completed. They have to be all the way done with it before it starts to count. This one is the student counts by career technical indicator code and grade. And so it starts to give you those total counts. Really great quick glance at kind of totaling up and aligning, what your student, what you think your student should be looking like. A lot of you have purchased external software. You're using third-party companies that are doing this, and you're doing it in real time. If what you see in your software that has been calculating tells you these numbers should looks very different than this report, then it might mean that something is being coded incorrectly somewhere. And so, you want to be able to if you've spent the money to purchase those tools, make sure that you actually utilize them to help give you that information. And that is the end. We'll go ahead and stop recording. But if any of you have questions for Mary.
I want to